Welcome to Software Snack Bites. I'm your host, Shomik Ghosh of Bold Start Ventures, and today we're excited to have Caroline Mack on the pod. And Caroline is COO of Spline AI and previously a growth product lead at Canva. In this episode, we're going to cover AI in the app layer, of course, but also image and video generation and also Caroline's learnings from Canva. So just to start off, maybe let's start with your backgrounds, Caroline. How'd you come to be the COO at Spline, and also just talking through kind of your career and life story to date?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, Shomik, great to see you again. My personal background, I'll try to keep it short, but I was lucky enough to grow up actually all around the world. So I was the daughter of a diplomat, still am the daughter of a diplomat, spent my childhood in India and Kenya, and then my teenage years in China and Taiwan. And that really did, shape my worldview. So when I was in college, I double majored in Chinese and statistics. And that combination of things in a roundabout way led me to a career in product growth and in tech. And I really saw tech as the way to, work on products that really spanned borders and gave people, opportunities to empower themselves, educate themselves, and upskill themselves, no matter where they lived in the world. So I worked at companies starting with TripAdvisor and then Google. I went to DocuSign and then later to Tencent in Africa, actually, kind of combining my African childhood and Chinese speaking. And then I spent my MBA at INSEAD, which was a truly very global program, and was lucky enough to get connected to the team at Canva during my time in business school and joined them in 2020. Crazy couple of years working at Canva on subscription growth. Incredible team and loved every minute of it. And definitely that drove this huge excitement about the creative tooling space. So I was introduced to the founder of Spline, Alejandro, through our seed investor, First Round Capital, and just got very excited about the gap in the creative tooling space when it comes to interactive 3D design. And so I was very excited to join him. I'm currently the COO, as you mentioned, which means wearing many different hats, but I do primarily focus on growing the business and scaling the business and kind of thinking about how to grow our monetization as well.
One thing that is just amazing is, given that you've lived in so many different places, you've had to learn different cultures, experience different languages, all that sort of stuff. I mean, I guess how has that impacted your building in software, right? And SaaS. And so from the beginning, are you thinking about how a user in India may experience a product differently than a user in the US? And how does that kind of influence your company building?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it influenced every career decision I made to date. So first of all, I really love working on very diverse international teams because I think that brings the perspective of, like you mentioned, what are people struggling with in terms of different markets, whether it be kind of payment gateways or access to cellular data. For example, when I worked at Tencent Africa, I learned a lot about how different African markets kind of struggle with access to data and the cost of it. And so each choice I've made in my career has really been focused on how do I work on a global product and how do I serve a very global customer base. And I think none more so than Canva, but Spline as well, where we have a very international customer base. And we do focus on issues like you mentioned, how do you serve a customer in India as well as you serve a customer in the United States?
It's amazing. It's something I wish I'd done more of. I did travel a lot, but I didn't live in as many places as I would have liked to have. But that's a future thing now. We'll do it in the future. But talk to me a bit about kind of as we dive into it. We'll dive into Canva and Spline a bit more. But just for users and listeners who don't know what Spline is, please describe what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Spline is a web-based collaborative 3D design platform. And that means really you can take an idea into our design platform. You can create from scratch, or you can generate assets, you can remix assets. And then what's really unique about Spline is you can ship that experience right into production with interactive real-time 3D. So that's a huge difference from the traditional 3D design pipeline. And we really do empower designers and developers to ship onto web experiences, mobile experiences, and then spatial devices as well.
And I'm assuming spatial devices is the new form factors that we're seeing come out now. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the generic way, I think, to address the many developments in that space.
Okay, that makes sense. So before we dive into Spline a little bit more deeply, I want to cover some of the learnings from Canva. And so, what an insanely amazing company, right? I think it's we just did a deep dive on this podcast a little bit ago, and it was 2 billion of ARR, growing 50%, plus cash flow positive. It's accelerating with the use of AI, like just amazing stuff. Like, I guess there's probably a ton of learnings you have, but is there a way that you can synthesize into some main learnings from your time there?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I guess I feel really blessed to have worked there. I joined, I guess, when Canva wasn't a household name, and now it certainly feels like it is. And you're absolutely right. The growth for the team there has been incredible. I think the biggest takeaway or learning from being there was that growth teams, especially product growth teams, should really be embedded into the core product teams as well. So Canva does an amazing job. The growth org really splits up cross-functional teams, and each team is focused on core KPI for the business. But that's typically attached to product teams as well. And so for a product-led business to incorporate growth in really everything they're doing, that's the first thing. I think they're best in class in that. And then that cross-functional squad was really important. So what that means is each growth team had, a couple front-end engineers, a back-end engineer, a designer, a product manager, and a data analyst typically sitting on it. And they were driving, one specific KPI forward. And what that meant in practicality was we could run dozens of experiments, simultaneously, and we could, select a winning variant and roll it out while we had many other experiments going. I've never really seen any other organization do growth in such an effective and impactful way. And a lot of those optimizations, as well as big bets, really drove huge growth levers over time. So something I'm definitely trying to replicate at Spline and anywhere I go from now. But I think the growth org at Canva has really become best in class.
Describe a little bit more about that pod structure, because I think what's interesting is you said, one, first of all, I don't think many growth teams have that level of engineers also working on it, product managers, and the like. But then also one thing that you said was that it was coupled closely with the product teams themselves. So maybe describe a little bit more about how that org came together.
So what that meant a lot of times was if a big new product launch was happening, you'd tie in a growth team to partner with them to make sure kind of the adoption of that feature or that product, happened in a more seamless way or hit KPIs. And so an example for that is Canva Sites launched while I was there. And the growth team was involved in how do you make Canva Sites discoverable? How do you make sure people are understanding how to adopt this new product? How are they retaining and activating, based on discovery of that new product? And I see, a lot of organizations can silo kind of the core product and the growth teams from each other. But if you partner them up, they really serve each other much better, I think.
I guess what the tension could be, right? Sometimes is the growth team wants to run an A/B experiment, right? A/B testing experiment. But the product team's kind of hey, we're just trying to ship this feature, right? Yeah. We're trying to delight the users and sort of stuff like that. So I guess how did that, I won't call it tension even, but just how did that get managed?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to the resourcing of the team. So when I mentioned that cross-functional squad, the fact that you have your own growth engineers and data analysts, that made all the difference. So you're not competing with the core product team for engineers to build out, the experiment layer. They're shipping the product and they have their roadmap, and you're kind of coming in usually, as they get closer to launch with some experiment ideas to drive growth, and working sort of on top of them or in parallel to them. I think where it does fail is if you're resourced by the same engineers or designers, and you're competing there to ship a feature and to do growth experiments, that that would be really difficult.
So how did you identify? I mean, you mentioned it was a subscription growth team, right? Like obviously there was a ton of free users coming up through the product, right? How did you identify like who may be worth engaging with to migrate up to the subscription tier?
Yeah, I think with Canva, similar to a lot of other companies I've worked with, like DocuSign as well, you ask some key questions in onboarding about their user journey. You can identify based on domain name, based on the user journey selections they make. That can help you kind of customize their onboarding path and get them to the paid product quicker, or get them to the specific features from the paid product that they might want. So for example, with a real estate agent, when I worked at DocuSign, getting them to the features relevant to real estate agents that were paid made a lot of sense. Or for Canva, if you select a marketing user journey, making sure you have some of those marketing tools like branding and magic resize in the app, and you see them within, your first session, that can be really important. So if you're doing that in reverse for a product, you kind of want to decide and discover who your core personas are, and then figure out a way very early on in onboarding to help them identify themselves, and then tie in, what features lead to higher activation and retention rate for those segments, because they are often quite different depending on the persona.
Is the way that you were able to effectively do that kind of by building out first like a template library, so then you can, when it's identified as a marketer, you can kind of bring some sort of marketing template to bear first and then have them kind of streamline into that usage of the product? Or is that not the right way to think about it?
That's definitely one part of it. So surfacing like contextual content and making sure it's relevant to their journey is one big part, especially for design tools. But also it's their, onboarding product tour once they have their first interaction with your editor, in Canva's case or in Spline's case. How do you direct them to the features they need, given kind of the complexity of the editor that's there? Because the aha moment for each user persona tends to be different.
Got it. Yeah, that's a key insight. So what things did you carry on from Canva to Spline? Because you had so many learnings there, I'm sure. Yeah. So like, kind of what are you really taking with you into the Spline journey?
Well, so many, first of all. I love learning from both experiences and from talking to other people at companies. But I think with Canva specifically, there's probably two to mention. One is your organic flywheels in the product are really important. So with collaborative design tools or collaborative tools in general, getting the basics right. So making sure your sharing flows and your team invite flows are really seamless. So you're not adding any friction for your users. That, designers love to share great tools and they want to work together. And so not getting in their way of doing that is really important for like a strong organic top of funnel. So that's one thing, and something that I focused on early at Spline, just making sure those flows are clean and working well, and optimizing them over time. And then the second one that's worth mentioning is having a UGC in-app community within the product. So I don't know that this is relevant to all products, but definitely in the design space and probably the productivity space in general, having that like template library, but also having it be user-generated content that's remixable is really important. We see that with like a Figma or a Notion. Canva does that really well with the Canva creators ecosystem. And then we have an in-app community in Spline that I introduced when I joined. It basically lets your creators share their work externally. And then with their audience, they're actually introducing your tool because they're sharing a remixable link, to your editor and your product. And that's been a powerful organic top of funnel tool as well.
We've seen a lot of people kind of come up with these, kind of whether it's called creator communities or product advocates or things like that.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would say, like out of that UGC content, would you find specific folks and say, hey, would you like to be a product advocate and kind of evangelist for the community? Or how do you kind of think about that sort of community aspect when you could have, if everyone shares, it can get crowded quite quickly. So how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, that's true. I think having shareable UGC content as a whole is beneficial, even without kind of a selected ambassador or affiliate program. But I do see a ton of value in companies that introduce affiliate programs. I think Webflow does this really well, making sure that they have, selected kind of experts or people they have selected to share their product with the world is really impactful and can bring out kind of a higher quality for that UGC content. Definitely opportunity to explore for us. We're an early company.
Yeah. Well, and also you guys are just early in the form factor, so like people are just sharing such unique and interesting designs from what they're doing. So it's kind of just, you want that broad surface area of people just sharing stuff. But
Yeah, absolutely.
in the area of 3D design, like I think what's interesting is, LLMs and image generation models, they do hallucinate. It kind of seems funny because it maybe might be helpful in this case because it might hallucinate something super interesting that the creator didn't even think about. And so how do you kind of think about that? Is that something that you believe is beneficial? Do you want to have it like kind of more constrained and have guardrails on it? Like what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I like the saying that each, generative model that gets put out there is always the worst version of what it will become. So I definitely think the generative models we see today, including, in Spline, they're rapidly improving. And so my assumption is that the hallucinations as well become more useful over time. But I think in general, we see AI generation for the 3D space as a great tool for ideation and kind of the cold start problem. But when we introduce it into Spline, it's not just the generation piece that matters, it's the full workflow. So the full 3D design process, and having that as a tool to lean on within the editor, but not something you have to use, is really important. So it could be, to come up with new ideas, to generate assets, or it could be to add to an overall more complex scene, that has interaction and, has a composition that's much more complex to ship into your product. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for how you use it. And we just look at it as a tool in your tool set.
So when I think 3D design, like I immediately just think gaming, because that's where my head goes. Like I'm sure you have use cases outside of that, but like is that the majority of the use cases? Like, hey, it's kind of 3D worlds and gaming and stuff like that, or is there kind of some other areas as well?
Yeah, it's not actually our primary use case. So I think where we focus is on the design industry. So, thanks to companies like Canva and Figma, the design industry has really grown a ton over the past decade. And that means, UI, UX designers, product designers, graphic designers, web and mobile, both design and developers. And we focus on that group because we want to empower them to actually build real things. So building in 3D, the traditional pipeline is quite fragmented and difficult to learn. But typically designers can only ever get to the stage of a prototype, meaning an image or video that they put out and have to then hand over to a developer. With Spline, you don't actually have to do that. So you can build the full interactive experience within Spline and take that right as a live embed into your website, your mobile app, or like we said before, spatial devices. And so it's a big leap for designers and developers that want to use 3D and want to approach it for the first time typically.
So it seems like a key part that you just mentioned was that, hey, normally you have to hand off to a developer. Here, you could still do that if you'd like, but also as a designer yourself, like who maybe you don't have access to a developer, or you don't want to, take someone's time or something, you can still kind of end to end with prompting and editing and whatever, kind of create a pretty rich experience yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And we have, dozens of export types. So you can kind of decide on your output. That means prototyping is an option rather than the default output. So you could choose image and video output still, or you could do a more complex code export. You could do a live embed into your product. The opportunities are kind of endless. And what that tends to look like also is designers and developers collaborating in Spline rather than having like this distinct handoff point. That previously happened.
So it looks like we're finally getting to that spatial type form factor that you were talking about. I mean, I would say like the Apple Vision Pro, it seems like launched and then kind of is still being tested and still being, figured out. But then meanwhile, you have like, I think the Ray-Ban Meta glasses that are being used like pretty frequently. And then, you have the Quest stuff and things like that. Like, I guess like, as you look at this space, like, how relevant do you think that will be for what you guys are doing? And is that something you're trying to invest more in at this time?
I think you're spot on. So the tech today for spatial content is still pretty far behind in terms of what platforms are capable of. And we've definitely in our, early days of Spline focused on web and mobile as, key outputs. But I think the investment by Apple is really crucial to development in this space. So the Vision Pro, obviously there will be, improvements on the hardware over time, but it's a huge leap forward for, specifically the design community. So the UX, combining UX and 3D content in a spatial environment, that's really important to see kind of how the future of this develops. And I think we see, Meta, Google, Microsoft, others kind of moving forward in that space as well. I'd imagine in the coming years, we see a lot of rapid development in terms of improving that hardware and getting it to be maybe closer to a sunglass than a heavy device. But at Spline, we're really excited about the developments there, and we're following them closely. And we plan to support, the devices as they make sense.
Is there does AR or VR one way is one of them more attractive to you in terms of what you're thinking about, or is kind of both are equally interesting?
Yeah, not necessarily. So today we support the Apple Vision Pro. We're actually the only design tool where you can ship natively to the Apple Vision Pro. You don't need to, build the experience on Unity and do that design developer handoff, which means you could, select to make an immersive VR experience, or you could select to make, a volumetric or window-based AR experience. And I think all types have their value. Really depends on kind of the design problem that's being solved.
Okay, so I got to ask you one hard question, which is basically every day on Twitter, there seems to be a new image generation, video generation, something really cool, and it blows up, right? Everyone's tweeting about it, everyone's really excited.
Yeah.
And so I guess in that context, right, and this is kind of, the investor type of question, right? But how do you differentiate from those companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately it's really important to understand that Spline's a platform. So we're solving for the full 3D design pipeline and design process, all the way from ideation to production output and hosting that asset for you. So it's a very different thing than, just purely an AI generation model. We are excited about AI generation in the creative space in general because it's overall lowering the barrier to entry for creators to get started, not just in 3D, but in general. But typically designers want, control over their experience. They want to create a composition. They want to solve a problem for their product design or for their website, their app. And so typically just the generation of the asset alone is not enough to get them to their end result. And so we see a lot of those generations actually making their way onto Spline, whether they're done in Spline or elsewhere. And it's typically just the beginning of that process. So we see over time, though, the full 3D design process being dramatically, simplified through AI models, not just generative models, but across the board. And we're really excited to play in that space. But I think, like you're saying, we're excited to see those models launch. And I think there's more complementary use because we're the platform they typically, the designers would typically rely on.
Got it. Okay, so even if they're generating, they still would use Spline to take that generation and then move it beyond the prototype, start to make it interactive, start to tweak different aspects of it. Yeah,
customize it, create a composition, add interaction, and then really most importantly, ship that into production.
That makes sense. So one thing is Spline and Canva both have this kind of bottoms up adoption, right? People really like using it. People are attracted to it. I guess when you think about growth in these companies, right? What's maybe different about an approach that Spline may take versus say what Canva did, or are there any differences?
Yeah, there's definitely differences. I think that the idea of reducing the barrier to entry so that more people can become designers and creators is a shared mission across both companies. 3D design, though, typically has been really dedicated towards artists and niche professionals. And I would say, Canva was tackling more of the marketing and graphic design space, which tended to be a little more accessible to begin with. So tackling the 3D design space, I think there's first the question of how do you get people comfortable with even exploring this space, and certainly having a 2D approach to 3D and making the editor feel very familiar to what they know already has helped. But I think AI models really do continue to reduce that barrier to entry. The other ways, I guess, that they're similar is that, viral word of mouth sharing motion. So something I mentioned earlier, designers love to share the tools they're working with. They love to share their work. And so relying on those organic flywheels and that, community content being shared is something that really helps broaden the audience for both products, I'd imagine. Spline were much earlier days than Canva, obviously.
Yeah, but the social media following is growing quite quickly. I guess because the users are sharing really cool stuff that they're generating with it. So it's awesome to see. But given some of that dynamic where you can just have a creator share something really, really cool, it blows up on Twitter, right? Like, this is not just Spline specific, maybe just in general. Like, do you think AI leads to just like more spikier usage of the standard SaaS app?
It's a really interesting question that you see work very differently across businesses. On a fundamental level, you have to be delivering solid value to your customers, right? So you have to be working on your activation rate and your retention rate and making sure that customers that come to your platform stick around, find value over time, and potentially increase their value and retain. So that remains true whether it's an AI product or not. I think AI products that launch and see that great viral success initially, but haven't done the core work to get their activation and retention rate correctly and maybe understand their target audience, they probably do see more of an issue around churn and kind of that spiky, shark fin effect. But with products that are, I guess, like Spline or platforms, I think AI launches are a great tool, right? So it can be a great top of funnel growth tool, but it's more of a launch can get people excited and get people trying your product. But ultimately, you need to make sure you're converting them, speaking to their specific user journey, and you're delivering more value than just that AI feature itself.
Yeah, unfortunately, AI is not solving some of the core problems that always have been around. We still need to solve retention and engagement and all of that.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
that makes sense. You mentioned, by the way, a lot around community and you were talking about the user generated content and stuff like that. In terms of just community generally, like, do you think early stage startups should be hiring someone to kind of manage that more actively earlier in their growth, or is it something that the founders need to be doing, or kind of what's your general advice for, I'm sure you talk to a lot of startups, right? Like, when people come to you, what's your general advice to them?
Yeah, definitely in the early days, I think founders should be fully in their community, talking to their users, making sure they understand what issues they're facing or what they need. And then as you scale, I do still think the founders should be involved in that actively. But you have to find, processes to figure out how to do that at scale for a larger number of users. So then having community managers and a team around that can be really helpful. I think also, in terms of growth, you can optimize and run growth experiments to no end. But if you have kind of user issues that you're not addressing, or you're not building, goodwill with users that are asking for things over here, these optimizations ultimately won't be as impactful. So I do think the idea of, prioritizing and listening to user feedback and user issues is actually a growth issue too. And so it's something I focus on a lot at Spline. And I think every early stage company should have their leadership involved in that.
That brings me to another question. Sorry, I'm just asking some random questions,
No.
but in terms of like growth, right? I think the common metric that everyone would look at is, okay, well then, user usage growth is going up, or whatever metric is being defined should be going up and to the right. Now, at some points, I imagine like there may be stuff that improves the product experience or something, but may not show up in like a specific KPI, right? Like I guess in general, like, should growth be very linked to clear measurable metrics, or is there kind of like some softer things that you should also be looking at? How do you kind of think about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. My bias, because of my statistics background, is definitely towards metrics being tied into, the growth initiatives you're running and measurable progress. But I think it's a good point that not everything is measurable. So that that question of user trust, customer trust, and goodwill, that is less measurable to some extent. You see it show up in retention metrics over time, but the attribution is a question mark. So I think, yeah, making sure you have a good pulse on how you're reacting in a timely way to urgent user needs and feedback, that's really important. And it's something you can try to quantify with your, support team. But sometimes it is a little bit of a softer metric. But ultimately, like, I'm very focused on, I'm a heavy Amplitude user. I think I have been through every job that I've ever had. And I'm a heavy believer that metrics tend to reflect, the work that you're doing to build your user base and build, value in the product. And so sometimes it's also the question of how granular and how accurate are those metrics that you're tracking. Maybe you're tracking the wrong metric.
Specifically in like kind of 2021 COVID area, we had a lot of companies that just did growth in terms of just user growth. Like they just got a bunch of users and it was amazing and just kept on growing. But then monetization wasn't necessarily kind of there. And so in general, for kind of early growth teams, do you advise picking kind of a monetization growth metric to kind of make sure that that's aligning, or how do you kind of think about that trade-off?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on what product you're working on when you start to do that. So for a company like Spline, or Figma is a good example, they turned on monetization a bit later in their company's journey, as far as I'm aware, meaning they built out a core product that was really strong and it had a strong offering before they ramped up monetization. I think that can be really valuable for highly complex products. And then, it has to be a completely different approach for products that don't need that heavy lift on the initial complexity of an editor, say. So for Spline, I think focusing on monetization early, which is something we did when I joined, was important to start understanding what are people valuing in your product. And you can do that in a number of ways. So you can experiment with, turning on certain features as premium. You can also talk to potential customers kind of in what you think is your target audience. So that's a tried and true way to understand what features they need or are willing to pay for. But usually it's some combination of the two, experimentation and kind of more qualitative conversations to understand where you should turn on monetization. And then unfortunately from there, it's a constant experimentation from then on.
Well, at least something that you and other growth teams are very comfortable with that experimentation. But, I want to ask you actually about a topic that a lot of founders are thinking about, which is pricing in kind of this sort of AI era, if you want to call it that. But basically, some of these models are quite expensive, but at the same time, you want people to experience the product, you want them to share it, you want to be free users, like all this sort of stuff. So how do you kind of think about pricing with these kind of AI features, and should you be then kind of charging an extra premium for the AI features like we've seen Atlassian do, or we've seen, I think Intercom also charges specifically for like the AI product, the AI SKU. Like, do you think that's something there? But then Canva seems to have bundled it in almost into that pricing. So it's like kind of two different models. Like, how do you kind of think about that sort of pricing exercise?
It's obviously a question on the top of many people's minds right now, especially founders of companies that have AI involved. I think ultimately, if you just boil it back down to business fundamentals with any feature launch, if there's a cost to, the usage of your feature, then you do need to think about unit economics and make sure it's sustainable as you scale. And so unfortunately for AI features, there typically is a GPU cost that's quite high associated with it. And that's why I think many companies have chosen to put that in a premium, packaging, whether it's pricing on its own or bundled within a subscription. And I think that's really important to being able to offer really high value AI features that have a high cost to businesses, but also potentially a high value to customers. But I think, like we just were talking about, pricing strategy is a constant project, and it's observing, analyzing, and then understanding how you need to change it. So I do think for some products, having a try before you buy kind of approach to AI features can be really valuable. So giving people a preview of what the feature is before they come on board as a paying user or subscriber can be valuable. And that's not true for all products. Really does probably depend on the unit economics for the business and how you can make that work. But for Spline, we do offer AI as part of our premium subscription. And unfortunately, that is because it's a necessity for the business. But I think, just finally, I think it's important to get off on the right foot with your users. So making sure you don't overprice and it's a reasonable ask for the value that they're getting is really important as well.
Sometimes founders get really scared about messing with pricing because they're just like, well, we put the pricing out there, oh my God, users will freak out, stuff like that. You've seen countless companies go through with this. Yeah. I imagine even at Canva, you may have even done A/B tests, like potentially maybe on pricing. Like, yeah. Is that something you think teams should be willing to do, is kind of do that sort of A/B of hey, show this user group one, show this to another and kind of see what works and if it affects conversion or not? How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah. Many A/B tests on pricing at this point in my career, I'd say. Yeah, it changes based on the stage of the company. So I think when you're earlier and you do get a strong sense of what users are willing to pay for, but you don't clearly know your price point yet, I think more maybe ambitious or brave experimentation is necessary. And then as you get into a more mature customer base, making sure you're optimizing rather than making rapid changes can be more impactful. I know at Canva, localizing pricing was a powerful lever. So making sure with a global customer base, you were right pricing for that audience, not just, overall. And that's something you see kind of with the maturity of a business becoming more important.
Yeah, but it sounds like early stage founders should not be afraid to experiment with pricing.
Yeah, I think if you're experimenting with pricing and scaring all your customers away, you better fix it very quickly. So paying attention to those metrics, not just setting and forgetting a price. But if you're seeing that, you launch a new feature and it's extremely valuable to users and they're willing to pay for it, that means you might have some room to, change your pricing.
Yeah. Well, before we kind of wrap things up, I guess the last question I would have for you is just, kind of paint the vision for the future of where Spline is going. Like, what's exciting to you that you guys will be accomplishing for the users in the future?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I think, our mission as a business is to make multidimensional design more accessible to more people and to really lower that barrier of entry and the learning curve for 3D design. We see a version of the future where design is increasingly interactive. Products combine 2D and 3D design, and spatial design is obviously an exciting evolution of that as well. So we see Spline as the platform to really drive that evolution in the creative space and give designers and developers more superpowers to really get interactive experiences into their product.
Well, it's a very exciting vision, and I'm sure for all the designers and people who are interested in 3D design and multidimensional design, I should say, they're probably very excited about listening to this. But thank you for all the insights, Caroline. Really appreciate it. I guess, is there stuff that you would like to highlight coming up for listeners specifically for Spline in the next whatever 1-3 whatever timeframe you want to say?
Yeah, we definitely will have exciting product launches that you should follow our Twitter to get updated on. But I think most relevant is probably we have a presence at Config, the Figma design conference. And that's, I think, June 26th and 27th this coming month. And our head of design is giving a speech and kind of explaining how to use Spline to designers and developers. So if you are attending that conference, either online or in person, I highly recommend tuning in if you want to learn more about Spline.
We will definitely make sure that there's some people tuning in for that. So thank you so much and really appreciate the time.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Shomek. It's nice to see you again.